All right, so get this, we're going deep on Suicide of the West by James Burnham today.
Oh, yeah, this was a classic.
Published back in 1964. It's considered like a foundational text for, modern conservatism.
Right.
But even if you're not into political theory or you don't lean that way politically, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
This deep dive is all about understanding, like, Burnham's main arguments and, like, really exploring the ideas he's putting out there about liberalism and Western civilization and all that.
Definitely.
So we've got excerpts from the book itself.
Great.
And we'll be bringing in some interesting background about Burnham and the whole era he was writing in. You ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
All right. So to kick things off, let's just talk about the man behind the book for a minute.
Okay. James
Burnham. He was more than just a conservative writer. He was like this chameleon when it came to ideas.
He was. He really was.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, started out as a Marxist.
Yeah.
Hanging out with Trotsky, of all people.
That's right, I mean.
But then something happened.
Good time.
It totally flipped his worldview upside down.
Yeah, the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939,
Right.
that was a major turning point for him. Shattered his faith in Marxism, and then, of course, he got kicked out of the Socialist Workers' Party.
Can you imagine that?
Wild, right?
Going from, like, a hardcore Marxist to, like, one of the leading voices of conservatism.
On a journey.
Talk about a plot twist. But I think that's what makes Burnham so interesting, right?
Definitely.
He wasn't afraid to, change his mind.
No.
He kind of challenge his own assumptions and just, like, follow the logic wherever it led him.
The intellectual honesty really comes through in his writing, too.
It does.
He's not afraid of the tough questions.
Right.
Or uncomfortable truths. Actually, I think he enjoys tackling those head on.
Okay, so before we dive into the details of his arguments, let's talk about how he actually approaches, like, this whole concept of liberalism.
Sure.
Because he doesn't just give us, like, a boring dictionary definition.
No. He doesn't.
He takes a much more interesting approach.
He does, yeah. He tries to define liberalism by looking at how liberals actually behave.
Right.
What they believe, how they operate in the real world.
And to do that, he uses examples of, like, real people.
Yeah.
Like, he points to folks like Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right.
I mean, she was, as many considered her, like, the embodiment of liberal values at the time.
Absolutely.
So he's not just, like, pulling ideas out of thin air. He's, like, looking at actual people.
Exactly.
And their actions.
And he goes beyond individuals, too. He points to how dominant liberalism is in places like academia, the media, politics. He even names names, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., John P. Roche, publications like the Washington Post. He's painting a picture of the intellectual climate in America at that time.
It's like he's saying, look, this isn't just some abstract theory. Liberalism is a living, breathing force.
Exactly. It shapes how we think and talk and make decisions.
And to be fair, he contrasts those examples with some of the non-liberal voices at the time, people like Senators Barry Goldwater and John Tower, who offered a very different perspective.
Absolutely, providing some balance.
Showing that even though liberalism was kind of the dominant force, there were still folks pushing back, offering different ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. And I think that's a key point to keep in mind.
Right.
As we, get deeper into Burnham's critiques.
Right.
He wasn't trying to, just tear down liberalism. He was trying to understand it.
Right.
Analyze its strengths, its weaknesses, and ultimately offer a different path forward.
Okay, so let's get to the good stuff.
Right.
What does Burnham actually see as, like, the core tenets of liberalism?
Okay.
Like, what are those fundamental beliefs driving this ideology?
Well, he boils it down to a few key points. First, he argues that liberals believe human nature is, well, basically good.
Yeah.
Or at least malleable.
Okay.
Not inherently flawed like some other ideologies might suggest.
So it's this idea that people can be improved.
Right.
That we're not just, like, stuck with some original sin or, like, predetermined limitations.
Exactly. We have the potential to evolve, to become better.
Okay, and tied to that belief is the idea that reason and science are, like, the ultimate tools for progress.
Exactly.
Right.
Liberals put a lot of faith in human intellect.
Yeah.
To solve problems, to make the world a better place.
So a very, like, optimistic and forward-thinking worldview.
Absolutely. Optimism is key here.
And that optimism extends to their view of history, too.
Right, right.
Burnham points out that liberals tend to believe that history is on this upward trajectory,
Yeah.
moving towards like just a more equitable future.
A belief in progress and a better tomorrow.
Progress is kind of baked into the system.
Exactly. That's the idea.
So Burnham lays out these core tenets of liberalism.
Right.
But he doesn't stop there.
Of course not.
Right.
This is just the beginning.
He goes on to analyze how these beliefs actually play out in the real world.
Exactly.
And that's where things start to get really interesting.
That's where the fireworks start.
Because this is where he starts to kind of like poke holes in the liberal worldview.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the first things he takes aim at is this idea of a universal dialogue.
The universal dialogue, yeah.
So can you unpack that a bit?
Sure.
What did Burnham mean by that exactly, and why did he see it as a problem?
Well, I think this goes back to the liberal faith in reason and progress. Burnham argued that liberals believe all problems can be solved through open and honest discussion.
Okay.
They envision this world where everyone comes to the table, shares their ideas, and through rational debate, they arrive at the best solution.
It's like this global town hall meeting where everyone gets a voice.
Right.
And like the best ideas win out.
Exactly, the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
And Burnham points out that this whole belief in the universal dialogue is closely tied to the emphasis liberals place on education.
Right.
They see education as the key to creating informed and engaged citizens who can participate in this dialogue.
Right.
Contribute to a better society.
So education isn't just about like acquiring knowledge.
No.
It's about shaping individuals.
Right.
Into good citizens who can steer society in the right direction.
So we're seeing how these different pieces of the liberal worldview fit together.
It's all interconnected.
The belief in human nature, the faith in reason and progress, and this emphasis on education.
Yep.
It all leads to this universal dialogue.
Exactly.
As the path to a better world. But, of course, Burnham doesn't just accept this at face value.
Right. He's got some serious criticism.
He has some criticisms.
Yeah. And this is, I think this is where his background as a former Marxist comes into play.
Absolutely. His past experiences shaped his perspective.
Right. So he's bringing a healthy dose of skepticism to the table here.
Oh, absolutely.
What are like some of the specific criticisms that he's leveling against this idea of a universal dialogue?
Well, for one, he argues that not everyone is actually interested in a genuine dialogue.
Right.
You know, he points out that some people, especially those with more radical agendas, they might use this supposed openness to deceive rather than to educate, to further their own agenda rather than arrive at the truth.
So it's like saying this idealistic vision of everyone coming together in good faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
To solve the world's problems, it might be a little naive.
A bit too optimistic, perhaps.
Yeah, he's suggesting there are, like, bad actors out there.
Oh, yeah.
Who will exploit the system.
Absolutely.
Who will use the language of, reason and progress.
Right.
To manipulate and control.
Exactly. Wolves in sheep's clothing.
So even if you could get everyone to the table,
right.
We might not all be playing by the same rules.
A very important point.
And that raises some serious questions.
It does.
About the viability of, the universal dialogue as like a real solution.
Right.
To the world's problems.
It's not a simple fix.
And this leads Burnham to his next critique.
Okay.
Which is even more fundamental.
Okay.
He argues that liberalism, with its emphasis on tolerance and open-mindedness, actually undermines the very foundation of truth itself.
No, that's a bold statement.
Okay, so now we're getting into some deep philosophical waters here.
Deep waters indeed.
How does liberalism undermine truth?
Well, Burnham argues that liberalism, in its efforts to be inclusive and tolerant of all viewpoints, it embraces a kind of relativism.
Relativism. So that's the idea that there's no objective truth.
Right.
That everything is just a matter of perspective.
Exactly. Your truth, my truth, but no universal truth.
And Burnham sees this as, like, a fatal flaw.
A major problem.
He's saying if there's no objective truth, then this whole idea of, like, rational debate, of searching for the best solution, it all becomes meaningless.
It loses its foundation.
Because if everything is just like a matter of opinion, then there's no basis for judging one idea as better than another.
Right. It's all just subjective.
It's all subjective.
Yeah.
And Burnham is saying that without a shared understanding of truth, the universal dialogue just turns into this, like, cacophony of competing voices.
Right.
all shouting their own version of reality.
Each claiming to have the answer.
With no way to determine who's right or wrong.
A recipe for chaos.
It's like he's saying that liberalism, in its efforts to avoid conflict and be tolerant of all viewpoints, ends up creating a world where truth itself is just lost in the noise.
Lost in the noise, exactly. And that critique of relativism is central to Burnham's whole argument. He believes that a society that loses its grip on truth is a society that has lost its way, a society that is vulnerable to manipulation and control by those who are willing to exploit this kind of moral and intellectual vacuum.
This is incredibly insightful.
It is.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground already. It's amazing how he connects all these different ideas together.
He's a master weaver, that's for sure.
And we're just getting started.
We've only scratched the surface.
I'm already eager to hear what other critiques he has up his sleeve.
Well, get ready. Next time we'll dig into some even more controversial territory.
Oh boy.
We'll be exploring Burnham's critique of liberalism's approach to power, its tendency towards statism, and its blind spots when it comes to dealing with, well, certain types of enemies.
I can't wait.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Okay, so picking up where we left off last time, let's dive into a really fascinating chapter, the universal dialogue. Burnham argues that liberals, put way too much faith in just reasoned discussion, like that's going to solve all the world's problems.
Yeah, it's it's almost like he's saying that they view it as this magical cure-all. If we just get everyone to sit down and talk rationally, all the conflicts and disagreements would just magically melt away.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Burnham really challenges that notion, though. He argues that not everyone is actually interested in a genuine dialogue, He suggests that some people, especially those with more radical agendas, might exploit this, openness for their own gain.
Right. So it's not enough to just create this space for dialogue. You got to consider who's actually participating and what their, motives might be.
Exactly. Exactly. Burnham even uses the example of someone trying to, rob you at gunpoint.
Yeah.
And he asks, would you try to have a reasoned discussion with them? Would you try to negotiate a compromise?
That's a pretty jarring analogy, but it definitely makes you think. There are certainly situations where dialogue is just not the appropriate response.
Exactly. And Burnham argues that liberalism, with its emphasis on, pacifism and diplomacy, can sometimes be blind to this reality. He really believes that there are situations where strength and, a willingness to use force is necessary to protect yourself or your interests.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially for someone writing during the height of the Cold War.
Yeah.
It seems like he's saying that sometimes you have to fight for what you believe in, even if it, goes against those peaceful instincts.
That's exactly what he's saying. Burnham argues that liberalism, with its, focus on negotiation and compromise, can be ill-equipped to deal with, those who are determined to use force to achieve their goals. He sees this as a fundamental weakness, a vulnerability that can be exploited by, more ruthless adversaries.
Okay, so we've talked about Burnham's critiques of the universal dialogue and liberalism's kind of a aversion to force, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But he goes even deeper than that, right? He starts to question the very foundation of how liberals view the world and the values that they prioritize.
Right. Burnham argues that liberalism has a particular value system, and, while it's well-intentioned, it can lead to some, unintended and even, dangerous consequences.
All right, let's unpack this value system a bit. What are the key values that Burnham identifies, and how does he see them, actually playing out in the real world?
So Burnham outlines 4 key values that he sees as central to this, liberal worldview: peace, justice, freedom, and liberty. He argues that, while liberals claim to value all of these equally, in practice, they tend to prioritize peace and justice above individual freedom and national liberty.
So it's not that liberals don't care about freedom and liberty. It's more about where those values fall in their hierarchy of priorities.
Yeah, exactly. Burnham sees this as a fatal flaw. He argues that this prioritization of peace and justice can often come at the expense of, individual freedom and national sovereignty. He believes that liberalism's desire to avoid conflict, to create this more just and equitable world, can sometimes lead to, a willingness to compromise on these, very fundamental principles.
Can you give us an example of how this plays out in the real world?
Sure. Burnham points to the issue of trade unionism.
Okay.
He argues that, while unions can be beneficial in, protecting workers' rights and promoting social justice, they can also, restrict individual freedom by, forcing workers to join the union, and pay dues, whether they want to or not.
Right. So in this case, the pursuit of, collective social justice, as envisioned by liberal thought, might actually infringe on the individual liberties of those that it claims to be protecting.
That's Burnham's argument. He sees this as a recurring pattern within liberalism, this tendency to prioritize the collective good over individual freedom.
It's fascinating how Burnham kind of challenges these deeply held liberal values. It really makes you question whether the pursuit of a more just and peaceful world might sometimes require sacrifices that will ultimately undermine the very freedoms that liberalism claims to champion.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, and Burnham doesn't shy away from those complexities. He acknowledges that there are liberals who genuinely prioritize individual freedom, but he argues that this is, well, a minority view within the broader liberal movement.
Okay, so we've talked about liberalism's tendency to prioritize peace and justice over individual freedom. Burnham also points to another interesting phenomenon, what he calls selective indignation.
Selective indignation, right. This is where Burnham gets into the psychology of liberalism a little bit. He argues that liberals, despite their, stated commitment to universal principles, often exhibit this, well, curious double standard when it comes to injustice.
What do you mean by double standard?
Well, Burnham contends that liberals are much more likely to be outraged by injustices committed by, those on the political right than those on the left. He sees this as a kind of, blind spot within liberalism, a selective outrage that's shaped more by, ideology than objective morality.
So he's saying that it's not just about, being against injustice in general, but about who's committing the injustice and whether or not their ideology aligns with liberal values.
Exactly. It's about picking and choosing your battles based on your political leanings.
So despite their claims to be impartial defenders of justice, liberals, according to Burnham, often exhibit a bias based on their own, political leanings.
That's his argument. He sees this as a dangerous inconsistency, a vulnerability that can be exploited by those who are, savvy enough to manipulate the liberal conscience.
It's a really thought-provoking critique. It forces us to examine our own biases, to question whether we're truly applying the same standards of justice to all, regardless of their political affiliation.
Exactly. It's a call for self-reflection.
And Burnham's observations about selective indignation are, they're particularly relevant, in our current political climate, where outrage and condemnation often seem to be driven more by partisan allegiances than by any objective assessment of right and wrong.
Yeah, it's more about scoring points than seeking truth.
Okay, so we talked about liberalism's value system. We've talked about its tendency towards this selective outrage. Another key element of Burnham's critique focuses on the liberal approach to change.
Right, change and progress. Big themes for liberals.
Burnham argues that liberals have this deep-seated belief in the inevitability of progress and a tendency to, embrace change for change's sake, sometimes without fully considering the potential consequences.
They're enamored with the new and the innovative, even if it's not necessarily better.
So they're not just open to change. They almost see it as a good in itself, like a sign of progress, a sign of advancement.
It's a key part of their worldview, the idea that history is moving in a positive direction.
Exactly. And Burnham sees this as both a strength and a weakness. He acknowledges that this openness to change can lead to, positive social transformations. But he also argues that it can make liberals susceptible to, dangerous ideologies and utopian schemes that promise a better future, but often deliver something very different. Can you give us an example of what Burnham's talking about here?
Sure. Burnham uses the example of the Cuban Revolution. Initially, many liberals were, supporting a Fidel Castro. They saw him as a liberator, fighting against a corrupt dictator. However, as Castro's, communist leanings became clear and he established a totalitarian regime, well, many of those same liberals were disillusioned.
So their initial enthusiasm for change kind of blinded them to the potential dangers of the ideology behind the revolution.
Exactly. They were so focused on the promise of progress that they overlooked the potential for tyranny.
Right. It's a real cautionary tale. It reminds us that not all change is progress, and that we need to be discerning about the kinds of change that we embrace.
Absolutely. We need to be critical thinkers, not just cheerleaders for change.
Exactly. Burnham urges us to look beyond the surface, to critically examine the ideologies driving these movements for change, and to consider the potential consequences before, just jumping on the bandwagon. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of Burnham's critique of liberalism, its faith in the universal dialogue, its aversion to force, its skewed value system, its selective outrage, and its tendency to blindly embrace change. But he also kind of digs into the social dynamics of liberalism, right?
Yeah.
Exploring why certain groups are more drawn to this ideology than others.
Right. He looks at the demographics of liberalism, why it appeals to certain segments of society more than others.
Exactly. And this is where his analysis gets really interesting. Burnham observes that certain professions, certain social groups, tend to be, more liberal than others, like who, for example.
He points out that academics, people in the media, those in creative fields,
Right.
tend to be more liberal than, say, those in the military or law enforcement or business. And he suggests that this might have to do with their differing worldviews, their exposure to different ideas, and perhaps even their economic interests.
So it's not just about individual personalities, but about the social and professional context that shape people's beliefs and values.
Exactly. Our environment influences our ideology.
Okay, so we're seeing how Burnham connects the dots between, individual psychology, social dynamics, and political ideology. But he goes even further, right? He introduces this fascinating concept borrowed from the work of Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian sociologist.
Oh, yes, Pareto's theory of residues, a fascinating concept.
Okay, residues. That's a new one. Can you break that down for us a little bit? What are residues in this context, and how do they relate to liberalism?
So in Pareto's theory, residues refer to the basic, unchanging instincts and motivations that drive human behavior. Pareto actually identified 6 classes of residues, but the 2 that Burnham focuses on are the instinct for combinations and the persistence of aggregates.
Okay, so what do these instincts have to do with liberalism and conservatism?
Well, Burnham argues that liberals, because they're often drawn to, intellectual and creative professions, tend to have this strong instinct for combinations. They're adaptable, they're clever, they're skilled at, manipulating ideas and systems. They're the foxes in Pareto's theory.
Okay, so they're the thinkers, the innovators, the ones who are, always looking for new and better ways of doing things.
Exactly, the change agent.
Conservatives, on the other hand, tend to be more driven by the persistence of aggregates.
Right, they're the lions.
They're the lions of Pareto's theory.
Yes, strong, loyal, focused on preserving traditions and institutions.
So they're the guardians, the protectors, the ones who, value stability and continuity.
Precisely, the defenders of the established order.
And Burnham argues that these differing temperaments lead to very different approaches to politics and society.
Absolutely, it shapes their whole outlook on the world.
Liberals, with their instinct for combinations, are, more comfortable with change.
Yeah.
With experimentation, with, social engineering.
They're the reformers, the progressives.
And conservatives, with their persistence of aggregates, are more cautious,
right,
skeptical of utopian schemes,
yeah,
more focused on preserving, what works.
They're the traditionalists, the skeptics of grand social experiments.
It's a really fascinating way of looking at the fundamental differences between these two worldviews.
It's a psychological lens through which to understand political divides.
And Burnham uses this framework to explain why, liberals, in his view, are so often drawn to utopian ideologies,
right,
like communism. He sees it as an expression of their, instinct for combinations, this desire to create a perfectly just and equitable world through social engineering.
They see the potential for a perfect society and believe they can engineer it.
Okay, so we've explored Burnham's critiques of liberalism's approach to dialogue, its aversion to force, its value system, its selective outrage, and its tendency to blindly embrace change. But one of his most pointed criticisms actually targets a core liberal belief, the power of education as a solution to societal problems.
Right, the belief in education as a panacea.
And this is where Burnham really challenges one of liberalism's most cherished tenets, I guess you could say. He argues that simply providing more education it isn't a guaranteed path to a better society.
It's a controversial claim, especially coming from a scholar like Burnham himself.
Right. It's an argument that might seem counterintuitive coming from, someone who is himself a scholar and an academic.
Right, but he's willing to challenge his own tribe.
He is, and he backs up his argument with some pretty stark historical examples.
Historical evidence is key to his argument.
He points to Athens, a society renowned for its intellectual achievements, but which ultimately succumbed to internal decay and external threats.
A classic example of a brilliant civilization that couldn't withstand the forces of history.
So he's saying that education in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to a more virtuous or a more stable society.
It's not a guarantee of moral or political strength.
And he really drives this point home with another even more chilling example.
A more modern example, perhaps.
Nazi Germany. Burnham points out that Germany at the time was one of the most literate and educated nations in the world.
A nation of poets and thinkers, as they say.
But yet this high level of education, it didn't prevent, the rise of Nazism.
A sobering reminder that knowledge doesn't equal virtue.
And its horrific consequences.
A tragic chapter in human history.
It's a chilling thought. It suggests that education, while important, isn't a magical cure-all for society's ills.
It's a tool that can be used for good or evil.
Exactly. Burnham is arguing that factors beyond ignorance, things like human nature, historical circumstances, ideology, they play a much more significant role in shaping a society's destiny.
It's a more complex and nuanced view of human progress.
It's a much more complex and nuanced view than the simple equation of, more education equals a better society.
Education is necessary, but not sufficient for a thriving society.
Exactly. Burnham is urging us to look beyond the surface, to acknowledge the deeper forces, the deeper forces that shape human behavior, both good and bad.
Call for a more realistic understanding of human nature.
And he's suggesting that liberals are too optimistic, too naive about the transformative power of education.
Too idealistic about human potential.
Okay, so if education isn't, the silver bullet that liberals believe it to be, then what is? What does Burnham see as the real threat to the West, and what does he propose as a solution?
Well, that's what we'll delve into in the next part. Burnham's central argument, the one that gives the book its provocative title, is that liberalism itself is the main threat to the West's survival.
That's a pretty bold statement. I can't wait to hear how he justifies that claim.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Okay, so we're back, ready to tackle this final part of Burnham's Suicide of the West.
The climax of our deep dive.
Last time we left off with a pretty provocative question. Is liberalism itself the biggest threat to the West's survival?
A bold claim indeed.
I'm definitely I'm ready to hear how Burnham, how he backs up that claim.
Well, get ready for some fireworks, because this is where Burnham really lays out his central thesis. He argues that liberalism, with all of its emphasis on peace and negotiation and compromise, it's just fundamentally incapable of dealing with the threat, the existential threat posed by communism.
Okay, so he sees liberalism as like a weakness, a vulnerability that communism can exploit. But why? What is it about liberalism that makes it so ill-suited to confront this particular ideology?
Burnham believes that liberalism's, core values, its core assumptions, make it almost impossible to really effectively combat an ideology like communism. He argues that liberals tend to view human nature as, inherently good or at least malleable.
Right.
While communists, they see human nature as something that needs to be, controlled and shaped by the state.
So they have like fundamentally different starting points when it comes to understanding, human beings and how society should be organized.
Exactly. Two completely different visions of human potential and social order.
And this leads to very different approaches to, to power and conflict.
Right. Liberals tend to believe that that conflicts can be resolved through, dialogue and compromise, whereas communists are much more willing to use, force and coercion to achieve their goals.
So in a way, liberals are kind of playing by a different set of rules.
Right.
A set of rules that communists, simply don't recognize or respect.
Exactly. They're operating on different wavelengths.
And Burnham is arguing that this mismatch in worldviews and strategies, it puts the West at a serious disadvantage in this struggle against communism. Yeah. He sees liberalism's, faith in reason and dialogue as a form of a naivete, a blindness to the realities of power and the true nature of the communist threat.
It's a clash of ideologies, with liberalism, in Burnham's view, being woefully unprepared for the fight.
Yeah, it's almost like he's saying that liberals are trying to fight a war with one hand tied behind their backs. They're bringing a knife to a gunfight.
A powerful image. Burnham argues that liberalism, with its aversion to force and its belief in the inherent goodness of human nature, simply cannot grasp the ruthless pragmatism of an ideology like communism.
So he really sees this as like a suicide pact, a slow surrender to a more powerful and determined adversary.
Yeah.
But what's the alternative? Is he suggesting that we abandon our liberal values altogether?
Not necessarily. Burnham does acknowledge the many strengths of liberalism, but he argues that we need to be more realistic about the world we live in.
Okay.
We need to recognize that not everyone shares our values, and that some are willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals.
So it's kind of a wake-up call, a warning against complacency and naive optimism.
A call to arms for the West to face the hard truths of the world.
And he's not just talking about foreign policy here, and he also applies this critique to domestic issues like crime and poverty.
Absolutely. Burnham argues that liberalism's approach to these issues is often misguided, ineffective, because it's based on, a flawed understanding of human nature and the root causes of these problems.
Okay, so let's start with crime. What's his main critique of the the liberal approach to crime?
Burnham argues that liberals tend to see criminals as victims of circumstance, as products of poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. He suggests that they often overlook the role of individual choice, of moral responsibility in criminal behavior.
So he's saying that liberals are too quick to kind of blame society for the actions of individuals.
In a way, yes. He believes that this tendency to kind of excuse criminal behavior ultimately undermines the rule of law, and it emboldens those who are willing to break it.
But don't social factors like poverty and inequality, don't they play a role in crime? It seems like he's kind of ignoring the systemic issues that contribute to these problems.
Burnham doesn't deny the role of these factors, but he argues that they don't tell the whole story. He believes that there's also an element of personal responsibility, of moral choice that liberals often downplay or ignore.
So is he basically advocating for a tougher approach to crime?
Yeah.
One that focuses more on punishment and deterrence rather than rehabilitation and social programs?
He is. He believes that liberalism's emphasis on rehabilitation is naive and ultimately ineffective. He argues that criminals need to be held accountable for their actions, and that society needs to send a clear message that crime will not be tolerated.
Yeah, it's definitely a controversial stance, but one that's sure to resonate with those who are concerned about rising crime rates and the perceived leniency of the justice system.
It's a tough-on-crime approach, reflecting a view that consequences deter criminal behavior.
And it really kind of reflects Burnham's broader argument, right?
Yeah.
About the limits of liberalism. He believes that a society that's too focused on compassion and understanding, that's too reluctant to use force and punish wrongdoing, is a society that's vulnerable to chaos and decay.
A society that risks losing its moral compass and its ability to enforce order.
Okay, so we've talked about crime. What about poverty? How does Burnham critique the liberal approach to poverty?
Well, Burnham's critique of liberalism's approach to poverty is similar to his critique of its approach to crime. He argues that liberals tend to view poverty primarily as a material problem, a lack of money and resources. And he suggests that they often overlook the cultural and behavioral factors that contribute to poverty as well.
So it's not just about how much money people have, but about how they live their lives, the choices they make, the values they hold.
Exactly. It's about the interplay of material conditions and personal choices.
And how does this tie into his critique of, liberal solutions to poverty?
Well, Burnham argues that, liberal solutions like, welfare programs and social services, while well-intentioned, often fail to address these deeper, cultural and behavioral issues.
So he's saying that simply giving people money or providing them with services doesn't really get to the root of the problem.
It's treating the symptoms rather than the underlying cause.
Yeah, it's a complex issue with no easy answers, but Burnham's analysis really forces us to kind of think critically about the assumptions underlying our approaches to poverty.
A call to rethink the welfare state and its unintended consequences.
So throughout this book, Burnham presents a pretty scathing critique of liberalism, highlighting its weaknesses, its blind spots. But what's the takeaway? What's the ultimate message he's trying to convey?
Burnham's message is ultimately a call for realism, a plea for the West to wake up to the challenges it faces and to adopt a more pragmatic, and less idealistic approach to survival. He believes that liberalism, for all its virtues, is ill-equipped to deal with the harsh realities of a world where power and conflict and ideology play such a dominant role.
So it's like a kind of tough love message, a warning that we can't afford to be, complacent or naive in the face of existential threats.
A stark warning about the need for strength and vigilance in a dangerous world.
This has been an incredible deep dive into James Burnham's Suicide of the West. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
A lot of ground, indeed.
From his personal journey to his critiques of liberalism's core tenets to his analysis of its shortcomings in addressing the challenges of the Cold War and beyond.
A sweeping analysis of liberalism's strengths and weaknesses.
It's been a fascinating journey, and even though the book was written over half a century ago, Burnham's insights remain remarkably relevant today. His analysis of the tensions between individual freedom and the collective good, the allure of utopian ideologies and the dangers of ideological blindness. I mean, these all continue to resonate in our current political climate.
His work speaks to the enduring questions of human nature and political order.
Burnham's work really reminds us that ideas have consequences. That the choices we make as individuals and as a society, they matter.
Our choices shape our destiny.
And that the future of the West, and indeed of the world, hinges on our ability to grapple with the complex challenges of our time.
A call to action for our time.
If this deep dive has piqued your interest, we highly encourage you to check out Suicide of the West for yourself. It's a challenging read, but it's one that will stay with you long after you've finished the last page.
A book that will make you think, question, and perhaps even change your perspective.
And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time.
Keep exploring.